Genesis 26:18 tells us Isaac dug again the wells of Abraham.
In every generation, there have been revivals, massive moves of the Spirit that changed the course of history. In every revival, there were believers like you who chose to answer the call, to become the one in their generation. Discover your call to be the one in your generation.
We're about to take you face to face with history. Welcome to Revival Radio. I'm your host, Gene Bailey. Listen, today's going to be fun because we're going to talk about one of my favorite people. This guy, Smith Wigglesworth, right here, look at this picture. He's wearing, as a young man, he's wearing his Salvation Army uniform. Now, why did I point this out? Because the connection to Smith Wigglesworth is the Salvation Army, and really, the Salvation Army is because of the General William Booth. We're going to talk about that. The Salvation Army, here's a hat actually from that time, and Doug, you actually brought this to us from that.
Yeah, my history is that my grandmother and my mom were both saved in the Salvation Army, so I owe a great debt to even William Booth. Now, the women used to wear these hats, and in more the modern era, they're made of plastic. But a friend from England, she had this, and it's the old one. It's made of straw.
It is.
And
That's
they said
amazing.
that it was cooler and it was just more easier, to wear.
Time out. The Salvation Army, that's not these guys.
I know, you're supposed to be giving money at Christmas time.
This is the little
Ding, ding,
bell
ding, ding.
at Christmas with the little bell guy in the top.
You were right, but it's so much more than that, and that's not how it
I can't
started.
wait. Let's go. I want to know.
Let's talk about William Booth. William Booth, before we get into him, and I know you got some history to tell me, Doug, but one of my favorite quotes of all time was from General Booth, and he says, "I'm not waiting on a move of God, I am a move of God."
I like that.
Yeah, and I thought this guy was serious about his call. But the Salvation Army, you do normally think of humanitarian aid and giving money and helping those poor, which they do that. But it didn't start off that way.
No.
It was far from that. So bring us into what's happening.
Well, even, today, the Salvation Army is a church, and they meet on Sundays, and they have church services, but it was born out of revival fires. And the revival fires began with a man called William Booth, who was saved under the Wesleyans. He was influenced by John Wesley.
And this is in the 1840s.
1840. It was called the Hungry 40s. You must remember at the time over in Ireland, you've got the potato famine that pushed like over 1 million Irish over to emigrate here to the States. And it was just a decade long of just finding food. And so he became a Christian. He was walking home at night and just had a revelation of the Apostle Paul on the Damascus road that he had to give his whole life to Jesus, not just add Jesus into his life. And he was an evangelist from day one. And that was a big problem.
So where did he preach?
Well, on the streets, because it's so funny. He was accused of using secular buildings for the gospel.
How dare he?
Where?
Of London.
Preach in London.
And okay, so I was just there.
You better put
London,
that flag
there we
down.
go. I was just there, and there's monuments all over the city to these big movements of the past, that Wesley and Whitefield, but William Booth. But in the 1840s, as this book says, this is by him. It's called "In Darkest England and the Way Out." England was dark, and you'll be amazed from the stories that we found how dark it was. But there were children on the streets, 100,000 in poverty in the streets of London. If you added all the bars, all the pubs, end to end, someone said it would be 30 miles long. So, it was dark, and just people on the edge of starve.
Is this why he called it an army?
Well, now that's interesting because it kind of grew like that. General Booth and their magazine was
it's kind of-
yeah. So they were at war against sin, and because alcohol and alcoholism, they used that, and it just fell into place, really. I mean, he hadn't intended to start his own, quote, church. It was interesting because he'd get all these people born again, and they wouldn't go into the churches. And there's a great story of a parson trying to get a guy, into Christianity. He said, well, sir, have you read your Bible? And this guy says, I can't read. He says, well, why don't you go to church then? He says, I don't have church clothes. I only have my work clothes. And so Booth had to find a home. And that's really, the beginnings of the Salvation Army.
Yeah, and William Booth, he really had that particular instance that you're describing really sums up how things got started, because the call of God on him was, wait a minute, I don't need to be in the churches. In fact, I believe the quote is that he found out that God told him, these are the people I want you to minister to.
Yes.
And these are not your upper class or the elite. These are the drunkards, the blue collar workers. These are the people who are having a hard time, the hungry, the not so clean, the not so rosy in their speech, the down and outers is what we would say.
I mean, there's a great illustration. He took his 16-year-old son, who was called Bramwell Booth, into the East London area. Now, East London was an appalling place. All the immigrants had poured in there.
Right.
16 to a room, not a house. Wow. And it stank. The Thames River, it flows through London. I swam in that as a boy.
Did you?
But it was a sewer.
Right.
And it was called the Great Stink, and London stank. So
wow.
Hers dad.
And why did it stink? Tell him why it stunk.
Because there was just no, sewage treatment, so it just flowed into all the rivers.
But there were also no sewage. They would actually, people that were dead, they would kill people and throw them in the river.
Yeah.
I mean, you had every possible form of cesspool that river was.
The Royals were busy ignoring it. I actually did searched out a history for a history teacher, and her family lived in that Great Stink, and her mother actually was a prostitute, a madam. So when you talk about the decadence of that era, it was kind of, she said, oh no, what did I end up from?
Well, I mean, okay, here's the deal. At darkest England, the prostitution industry was $1 billion industry.
Wow.
So what did, before you get into that, so this is a hat. Obviously, women were involved in the Salvation Army. How did General Booth, how was his approach to women?
Catherine Booth, she was a feisty lady, and we love her because she said to her husband, I have to be able to preach. And whereas it was like not what women did. I mean, they were in the home.
Well, it's not just that they didn't do that. I mean, it was almost forbidden that they did that.
Yes, in many cases. But Catherine was an entrepreneur, a rule breaker, and William Booth got on the right side and let her do it. And the very coolest part is that it was a core part of their whole organization that women would have this integral right to be able to express things that historically had only been men. I mean, I read diaries of some of the ladies who went into Wales and how they basically changed. They walked in and some of the Welsh men weren't real happy. And so they're up there with their children talking in English, and the men didn't know that they were Welsh ladies. And so they're saying in Welsh all these awful things because they're clearly not saved men. And this lady spoke out to them and just said, I am a Welsh lady, and how dare you talk to me that way in front of my Welsh-speaking children?
I just remembered something that's on our set. We have, here's a picture of Evangeline Booth.
Their daughter.
The daughter of William Booth. But there's something else. I'm going to go over here. Yeah, don't mind me. I'll be right back. And get this. This is a poster that he did on the Salvation Army, and talking about women. Oh boy, that's the girl, the Salvation Army lassie. So he talked about how women outranked men in the Salvation Army 5-1.
Absolutely, and even today, often the head of the Salvation Army is more inclined to be female than male. But that broke, the mold in Victorian era. Here's a great quote. So we have Catherine Booth, wife of the great William Booth, and she was more educated than him and a better speaker than him. And okay, here's a great quote. If I ever am charged, a gentleman of those days says, if I am ever charged with a crime, don't bother to get any of those great attorneys to defend me. Get that woman.
Right.
And she was called the mother of the Salvation Army. So, I mean, even though she was strong, and because in the beginning, William said, you stay in your place as a woman and us guys will take care of it. That wasn't going to happen. So she was strong, but in her defense, she always said to him, if you feel that we're supposed to do something, I will follow you.
Right.
Well, I love that every time we study revival, we end up hearing this woman was able to stand up and deliver this message. It wasn't like we only have 50% of the people out there delivering messages. It allows everyone, no matter their ages, to be out there delivering the messages that God has.
Kind of the precursor to the suffrage movement.
It was, absolutely. She was a big pioneer. And there were, the Pentecostals years later, Amy Semple, Maria Woodworth.
Etter.
This woman inspired them, even today. She's
So
having a great
I
influence.
noticed that the Salvation Army, when they're shown, in the movies from way back and all that,
And Guys
always
and
had
Dolls.
they had a band,
Yes.
and they were marching. Why a band?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, my mom, she always, she aspired to be in the Salvation Army. Here is an old photograph of my mom. She's now in her 80s, and it was a visiting Salvation Army band. The band was everything. Because here's what would happen. Here's a great story. William Booth was in a service, and they had a band, so it was a brass band, and he noticed everyone was just in with the music. And he was amazed by that, because they would normally sing these dreary old hymns. So he said, "What's the music?" And the minister beside him was not happy. He said, "It's a drinking song." It was about champagne, and but they put Christian words to it.
That's like what we did with the Star Spangled Banner. That was a bar song.
All the carols that we sing here today. So he came out with this great quote, "Why should the devil have all the good tunes?"
Yeah.
And okay, so he'd be preaching up in Scotland, and they took the words to an old song called "Here's to Good Old Whiskey."
Right.
And these Scots would be just, along, but it was Christian words to that. And so the band would march through town, and everyone would follow
the band.
And they'd take them like to an old, an old warehouse, and they'd preach the gospel. So he was a pioneer in some ways in music. Now, of course, they had no copyrights of those days, and so in later years they would do their own.
So was there any government resistance to the Salvation Army?
Yes, because here's the deal: do not disturb the peace or rock the boat. And even today,
And he was.
Well, the title to this, The Salvation Army, Heathen England. I can't imagine with Victoria
Yeah, I'm
this
sure
is
that
going to
would
be.
go over real big.
This is going to be.
I mean, they would come into a town.
That's fake news.
They would come into a town, and there's going to be a revolution or a riot or a revival. They would hit it. But, I mean, even today...
A revolution.
There we go. Yeah, because they would come in and disturb the peace. Even today, there's a crime in England called disturbing the peace.
Wow.
And so they were, because they would preach the gospel, and there'd be a riot, so they'd blame the preacher instead of the rioters, really.
And he's down in
Some
the
things
middle.
haven't changed.
There we go.
And he's down in the worst end of town, so I mean, he's going to already be where the rabble rousers would
But
be.
it was
anyway.
more than just riots and picketing or whatever. I mean, they actually had stuff thrown at them, rocks and stoning.
That's
and,
why you talked about the hat. Right?
Yeah. So they were protected. So,
Some
one of
died.
the stories I like was about, maybe it's because the guy was Irish, but about the boxer that became his bodyguard.
Okay, so here's a young William Booth. He would have to walk 8 miles to the east end of London, and he would preach. He'd get beaten up, and he'd come home bruised and bloody. Now, he was a big guy, so in the end,
Looks like a big guy.
he had to have his own bodyguard, and he was a guy from Ireland, and he was an Irish boxer. And so there's great stories here. Booth would be preaching, and I mean, people would heckle and stand up and throw stuff, and still this guy would roll up his sleeves and just patrol the aisles. And he said then all these guys became meek as lambs.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
but
Peter Monk was his name.
that's the guy. That's the
Yeah, that
guy.
he would actually, he would stop them. Imagine at church on Sunday, the bouncer walking down the center aisle of the church going, "Yeah, you come out," and taking people out. There's probably a lot of pastors that might like that in their church. A few church members they'd like to take out. But the reality of the general's boxer, as he was called, was that he was needed. So he wasn't because of the actual physical attacks that came on him.
They had 4 years of brutality where mobs would rise up. Now, of course, they were called the Salvation Army, but there was a group called the Skeleton Army who
Right.
would just, they'd go into a town, they would find them. Here's this. Okay, in 1882, 669 Salvation Army soldiers were knocked down or assaulted. 60 buildings were just torn apart. It took on Sundays, 1,500 police just to allow people to go to church. It was a very tough and brutal time. There was a riot for anything. So the government were like, don't cause riots. But they were going to make a change.
And
What
they
changed
sure
it?
did.
I mean, how did the government eventually kind of get on their side, I guess?
Oh, yeah. This is
How did they turn the tide?
Oh, well, it affected them because these mobs then would go after the police. So they'd go into the building and drag these guys out and beat them up. So that stopped that when it hurt them.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, they took the side of the Salvation Army.
Wow.
And I think, again, remember who he was called to. He was called to the drunkards, the pimps, the prostitutes, the dregs of society. And that's who he ministered to.
Just a great quote here. He said he found his destiny in the slums of London. And he told his son, Bramwell Booth, he took him out one night, and Bramwell said it just stank. The whole place stank of beer, and people did not wash in those days. And William said, these are our people, and I want you to love these people. Because even though there was hundreds of charities, especially in the East End of London, that poured in the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars, because the Victorians were very generous, crime was increasing and poverty was still increasing. So, they were trying to help, but it wasn't helping.
So you got this band or this army, or we would even call it by today's standards a resistance or a faction of society that's made up of, and the people that joined the Salvation Army, they were all these guys that got saved. So now you got a little bit of rough people that are all part of this Salvation Army that are baby Christians at best.
Yeah, but you know what? They were on fire. Because they had a passion. It wasn't about theology, although that would come afterwards. They just knew I was an alcoholic, I was this, I was that, I was dying, and they just thought, well, it was the born-again experience that Wesley had preached. He got from, that Booth had preached that he got from John Wesley.
Right. So how did it come to America? How did that, obviously, in the late 1800s, it's in America. We see stuff in America.
Well, we have a guy here called Samuel Logan Brengle. There's a great story about him. He was a successful pastor in the States in the late 1800s, and he wanted to get his hands dirty, so he went over to the East End of London, and he met with William Booth. And Booth said, you've been a boss and your own man for too long. I'm assigning you to clean the boots of the Salvation Army officers. Just a great story here. So, he's cleaning these dirty boots because they didn't have paved roads then. It was dirt, and it wasn't good dirt either. And he's just cleaning these boots, and he's thinking, I could have had a good church in the States and a good income. What am I doing, here? And Samuel had a vision. In the vision, he's cleaning these boots, and all of a sudden he sees Jesus cleaning the feet and washing the feet of the disciples. And he said, Lord, if you clean their feet, I can clean these boots. He became a leader. Of course, the Salvation Army then went back to the States and is the aid organization.
We had a couple, when they came over here, I mean, many of the countries they went into, there was successful integration where they were able to help and set up ministries. Here in the States, wasn't there a couple that actually were killed when they first started out?
Oh, yeah. So it was brutal. And they went after, the problems of the day. I mean, they took the power of the gospel outside the church into rough or dangerous areas. Yeah, absolutely.
Courageous men. I mean, we now, we have all of these crusades where we're talking about, stopping trafficking of all these different things. But I mean, that's not something that's new,
Okay.
Yeah. So before we get into that, let's talk about the government at this time, because we touched on it. The government didn't really want to disturb the peace.
No.
But there was a reason why they didn't want you disturbing the peace. We didn't want you to don't get too crazy here, because they were hiding something.
It was like an iceberg hidden under the city. It was like that thing that we don't talk about in our family. And of course, the Victorians had this very pious, outward, sensibility of being very proper, but we all know it was not proper underneath.
Right. Well, we watch the movies of that era. We make movies, and it's all about, the proper way to do things and the proper this, and how wonderful it had been in that time. But by looking at this book, The Darkest England and the Way Out, and reading the chapters in here, the submerged, the homeless, the out of works, the verge of the abyss, the victims, the criminals, the children of the lost.
I mean, it's Charles Dickens' hell on earth, workhouses and everything else.
So I discovered it was very hard and shocking to uncover something that is happening right now, and it was child trafficking for brothels. Unbelievable. So it was $1 billion industry.
$1 billion?
£8 million pounds. Yeah, £8 million.
Wow.
If you,
Sure. So we don't want you to disturb that peace, because it's quite profitable.
Well, that's embarrassing us, because we're very prim, and it was like, an iceberg that the Salvation Army were about to hit, and we'd see who'd win.
But this was also something after the prayer revival in 1857. We had that happen everywhere, where people were looking at what was wrong and what was right, and taking those steps. Here in America, they did it town by town, community by community.
Yeah.
And
So when you were talking about the government a while ago, basically what you're telling me when you say an iceberg, most of the iceberg is underneath the surface, and it's just the tip that is visible.
Right.
And you're saying that General Booth is exposing the light on the underbelly of
Here's the deal.
Victorian England, is what you're telling me.
I mean, the Houses of Parliament in the early 1800s, it was surrounded by brothels and by bars, and a whole lot of the members of Parliament. And example, a brothel would give, free services to the local police force. And so it was a dangerous thing, to go up against these. And there were some pioneers who tried to help, and they were always trying. Okay, the age of consent was 12 years old.
Wow.
Right.
wow.
From 1275. And so after 12, a girl was not protected. But then a few years earlier, I think 1881, they bumped it up reluctantly to 13. But here was what the Salvation Army were pushing for, to move it up to 16. How did that happen? It was a girl called Annie Swan. So they're reaching out to the lost, they're growing, and, it's brutal, but it's tough. They're seeing thousands come in, and they had a small headquarters building. And one morning, they went to open it up, and a 17-year-old girl called Annie Swan, who is dressed in these silk clothes, which are the clothes of a prostitute. And she demanded to see the general. And it's like, okay, so Bramwell Booth, he's brought in, William's out and about, and he has the most shocking story that his ears have heard. And he kind of semi-doubted it until his wife came in. And here's the story. She said, I applied for a job, housekeeping, house help, and I took my trunk of all my worldly belongings there. And it's not, the job I applied for. It's a brothel. Her clothes are taken, from her. She's dressed up in these awful, silk clothes, and she's locked in a room and told, you must do what we tell you. But she was a strong girl, and she escaped.
Wow, that was hard to do.
I mean, but it was, and she said, look, it's a trade. There's thousands of these young girls being trafficked or shipped to the continent, to Belgium and France, unknown to almost everybody. And so Bramwell is like, is this real? But then he said, we have to do something about it. And then we now enter, a real life drama. It was a 6 weeks kind of undercover investigation.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there.
That's cool.
Because we're out of time, and we're going to pick that story up next week about what happened in London during that time.
It's a great story, Gene.
But before we go, I want to talk to you about your role. Now, we talk about some of the negative aspects of Christianity and the negative things that happen in London. And, by all means, this isn't everything that happened. But there's so much more that we can take from these stories. Number one, General Booth was a man, Greg, that was committed to, once he found his calling and he understood, these are my people, this is where he laid root to what he's going to do. And he attacked that. Isn't that amazing, Greg, how what God can do, he had no idea what he was about to walk into. He had no idea, no concept of who God was going to bring him in touch with and how he was going to not just change people's lives.
Change a nation.
He was going to change the nation.
And I'll never look at the Salvation Army again.
Yeah.
I'll look at it differently.
And that's exactly the point. He changed the person in front of him. The guy that needed saving, the drunk in the bar, he was there. And so often, even in the 70s, as those of us of a certain age were through the Jesus movement and people came to church, I remember people coming to church that were not the standard look of church at that time. Their hair was long. They maybe they sure didn't wear a suit in 60s.
Had sandals on.
We're talking
Jesus.
60s and 70s, really.
California, we're talking shorts and
and suddenly they're at church and they're talking about Jesus, man. And
Cool.
And so, but the statistics is only 40% of the people that got saved during that movement stayed a believer. And the number one reason why is because so many churches didn't know what to do when the lost came to visit.
Yeah.
And they didn't know how to handle that. All right, I know you're going to want to watch next week because we're going to pick up this story and we're going to learn about another man, a man by the name of William T. Steed. And you're going to find out more about General Booth and the Salvation Army. See you next time.
Who's Steed?